Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the What's Up KLCOA webinar series. Tonight's session is all about the water. I am KLCOA co-president Deb Ratchko, and before I do some introductions, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I would ask that everyone keep themselves muted throughout the presentation. And after the presentation, there will be opportunity to raise your hand, or you can put your questions in the chat box at any point throughout the meeting, and we'll ask them at the end. So I'd now like to introduce KLCOA Vice President and Stewardship Director, Jim Prince. Jim has been instrumental in organizing the What's Up Kennisis webinar series. So thank you, Jim. Go ahead.
Thanks, Deb. Next slide, Frank, please. So this is just a bit of a background. Jim Prince, as Deb said, the VP of KLCOA and the Stewardship Director. Here's the agenda we're going to follow tonight. We'll just do a bit of a welcome and a background around What's Up Kennisis webinars that we've been holding. We have two guest speakers tonight. I'll introduce them in a moment, Frank Faguli and Annie Robertson. And they're going to talk about water quality monitoring in Haliburton County, the Kennisis Lakes, and some new information we just got about microplastics in our lake. And we'll follow that about 7:45. We'll try and wrap up the presentation portion. And from participants, questions, as Deb said, put them in chat, and you could actually go off mute at the end and ask questions as well. And we'll try and get you out of here by 8 o'clock. One of the things we do at the KLCOA is we try and reflect back on our 2021 survey, and we look at what the survey told us about what our members and community members value, and we try and focus our webinars and our programs on that. So in our survey, 99% of respondents said maintaining our excellent water quality is very important or very important. So that's one of the drivers for some of the programs we do. Next slide. So about What's Up Kennisis, I think this is the fourth or fifth or sixth What's Up Kennisis we've done. We're looking for suggestions from the community to have one in the fall and then in the following year. So a couple of suggestions have been boating safety and etiquette on the Kennisis Lakes, pesticides in our shorelines, renting your cottage, tips and tricks for happy renters, happy owners, happy lakes, and invasive species. So those are some suggestions, but if you have any suggestions about a webinar you'd like us to host, please send it along, klcoinfo@gmail.com. Okay, next slide. We have what we call our three-legged stool that the foundation of our lake health is built on. We like to do three things to keep our lake healthy. We promote natural shorelines, healthy septic systems, and we do water quality monitoring to see how well we're doing, because it is all about the water. We really value the properties we have, our waterfront properties, and we value what the lake brings to us. Next slide. So drink, swim, fish, that's what we do in our lake, and we want to make sure we keep it that way so we can do all of those things and other recreational things we do in our lake. Another bit of information we had from the 2021 survey was that over a third of the folks on the lake still drink water from the lake. I do, I think Deb does. It happens to be that we all have granite underneath our cottages. Wells are expensive. And you see 41% are bringing drinking water, but I'm sure those folks are also using lake water for washing, cleaning, and other things, and maybe even boiling some of the water. So it's important to keep the quality of our lake good, and because we are drinking that water. Next slide. So tonight we have two guest speakers. Frank Faguli, he's the environmental program coordinator from ULinks. I work very closely with Frank. I wanted to make sure everybody knows, full disclosure, I am also a co-chair of the ULinks Management Board, and I'm the chair of Woodlands and Waterways EcoWatch. So Frank and I have had a lot of work together over the last couple of years. It's been really quite enjoyable. Frank has a Bachelor of Science in environmental biology from the University of Guelph. And Annie Robertson is here tonight as well. Annie has just graduated from Trent University, and her fourth-year capstone project was on microplastics using samples from Kennisis. And Annie just completed a Bachelor of Science with honors biology and environmental environmental research science. And Annie just started working at the brand new Canoe Museum in Peterborough. So if you're going to make the trip down to the Canoe Museum, which I'd all encourage you to do, you'll see Annie working there this summer. Next slide. And I think we're over to Frank to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here at this meeting today. So the presentation I have is called Testing the Waters, just overviewing our water quality program in Haliburton County, and also going over a Kennisis Lakes update, who's been a participant of this program since July of 2022, when the program began. Just a very brief overview about ULinks and who we are. We are one of the 19 initiatives of the Haliburton County Community Cooperative. We're a not-for-profit organization that's been contributing towards Haliburton County since 1999 under the name of ULinks, but we've been conducting community-based research in the county since 1989. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary in 2024, and we're very happy and proud about that. We address the cultural, social, economic, business, and environmental sectors in Haliburton, but to be honest, 80% of the work that we're currently doing is in the environmental sector, where we broker research project opportunities between the Haliburton community and students and faculty at post-secondary institutions such as Trent University, Fleming College, Toronto Metropolitan University, Ottawa Education Group, and other institutions as we continue to branch out. To date, we've seen over 2,500 students engage in over 500 research projects, all of which are available online in our internal database. And just a real brief, what sets community-based research apart from academic research is it's driven at the community level. So it starts with folks such as yourselves that identify problems, challenges, gaps of information that you're experiencing in day-to-day lives. And then we pair those with the best of the best post-secondary students, whether that be at the undergraduate or graduate level, depending on the level of expertise needed to engage in the project. And those problems get solved. Also, to date, we've seen about 20 research projects completed with the Kennisis Lakes Cottage Owners Association. The link at the bottom of the screen here, very easy to remember, database.ulinks.ca is a repository for every single research project that's been concluded through our organization. Now, moving on to the Woodlands and Waterways EcoWatch, which is an auxiliary program under the umbrella of ULinks. This was developed to address an environmental data gap within Haliburton County through both monitoring of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. And the goals here are to involve the community in monitoring and to ensure that the data is actually used for decision-making rather than just being stored on a shelf somewhere out of sight, out of mind. So the two parameters or two realms that we engage in are aquatic and terrestrial through water quality monitoring and terrestrial biomonitoring. Through the former, that's done in two components. So the first being benthic biomonitoring, which Kennisis Lakes is also part of that program. We use benthic macroinvertebrates as biological indicators to determine common aquatic pollutants in the presence of those. Certain groups of benthics are more sensitive to stressors and can be indicative to overall ecological health, depending on the species abundances or absences. So on the figure on the right here, we have three that are circled that are part of a indice group known as EOT, or Ephemeroptera odonata trichoptera. This consists of damselflies, dragonflies, caddisflies, and mayflies, which are, out of the 27 groups that are sampled in that benthic program, the most sensitive towards common aquatic pollutants. The next is the Testing the Waters program, where we're assessing parameters like pH, dissolved oxygen and temperature, and nutrient levels as chemical and physical indicators to evaluate the health of lake systems, harmoniously pairing with the benthic biological indicators to give us a holistic image of water quality health. The next component is the terrestrial biomonitoring, which is done in the form of permanent sample plots in Haliburton County's forests. So we're doing long-term monitoring for changes in forest health over time, looking at things like disease, pests, effects of climate change, and other disturbances. To date, we have 33 established 20-meter by 20-meter plots across 4 properties, all managed by the Haliburton Highlands Land Trust. And we're also very excited to share that this fall we'll be establishing an additional 4 sites at the Haliburton Sculpture Forest to look at some effects there by deer and moose browsing. As I mentioned a couple slides ago, we really endeavor to have our data used for informed decision making, and we provide our data through 3 primary platforms. So the first, as mentioned, is the ULinks internal database at the link seen on screen. We also make great use of the data stream platform hosted by the Gordon Foundation. We have updated our data set recently to include all of 2023's data, as well as the winter from 2024. That I have a DOI available at a later slide. And then we also have issued water quality reports to all lake associations participating in both our water quality program as well as the benthic biomonitoring program. The real contrast there is that we gained student engagement with the benthic biomonitoring program, while as to date, though very open to including community-based research as a function of it, it is solely done by staff and citizen scientist volunteers for the water quality. So now we're going to get into the Testing the Waters program. One thing to accentuate here is we have very large engagement of citizen scientist volunteers. In fact, you can see folks from your Lake Association in the middle, where the success of the program has largely been driven by volunteer hours and boat drivers and citizen scientists that have been coming out and conducting sampling with us, really making the legs of this program possible. So as a thank you for all the people that have participated in the program so far. So testing the waters, what's the point? Well, the real thing here is that for Haliburton County, we lack both a watershed council and conservation authority. And the only regular testing that's happening in the county is through the Lake Partner program, which you'll see in a few slides. There's a very limited sample suite of parameters that it's testing for. As always, hindsight is 2020. This really should have been something that had started back in the acid rain era, but here we are now, and we're doing the best with what we have. So in terms of working with the resources we have now, we're very confident that we're maximizing utilization of all of that. The needs here are to establish baselines against what future actions can be measured. So looking at the impacts and the positive benefits of the modified decision-making, land use changes, legislation initiatives, also looking at the effects of constant stressors and changes that are affecting the environment, like climate change, growing populations, differences of land use, inclusions of other activities on the lake and shoreline use. Haliburton County relies very heavily for its economic sector on clean water. We have a very prosperous recreation and tourism industry for Haliburton County. And so it is really in everyone's best interest to be maintaining this to perpetuate that industry going forward. And then also, Haliburton County is home to numerous headwater streams that ultimately feed into the Great Lakes watershed system. We see about 2.1 billion cubic meters annually flowing into lower watersheds, 60% of those going to Lake Ontario, about 23% to Lake Huron, and then another 17% to the St. Lawrence systems. And just to visualize what the headwater presence in Haliburton County looks like, each one of these star icons represents a headwater lake. We can see Kennisis Lake here with the red star at the very top, and lots of responsibility in terms of passing on the best quality water that we possibly can, as we would want to see from preceding lakes and water managers upstream from where we are, if that would be applicable. One other thing to note here is that this platform set up by CEWF, or the Coalition for Equitable Water Flow, this system gets leveraged by your organization to have live monitoring of the water levels for Kennisis Lake, and really offers a great resource for many aspects of water quality monitoring. So just to look at the lake associations engaged in our program so far, our engagement has been very lake association centric to date, as ways to minimize the logistic barriers and financial costs with the analysis and testing. So to date, we have 60 sampling locations that are spread across 41 lakes in the Haliburton County region, and we're continuing to grow these numbers. This time last year, we engaged with 10 lake associations. And in fact, as of late April of this year, we started onboarding an additional 15 lake associations, which we anticipated we would see by the end of 2025. And in reality, we're just over a month later, and we have one free spot remaining for lake associations to join the program. So it really accentuates the uptake and values of ecological monitoring for water quality in Haliburton County. These sites are primarily focused on Trent Severn Waterway, drawdown lakes, and non-reservoir lakes. We currently have one reference site on Stocking Lake, and we'll be endeavoring to add additional reference sites within 2024. So just looking at the program by the numbers over the last 2 years. So this program has seen over 1,500 water quality measurements taken. These would include things like pH measurements, conductivity, dissolved oxygen, temperature. We've also seen over 2,100 water chemistry data points analyzed by our partners at ALS Environmental in Waterloo. Over 870 volunteer hours have gone into this program, 220, rather more than 220 of those being allocated towards training citizen scientist volunteers on our protocols, procedures for the program. We've seen approximately 140 volunteers across all of the lake associations engaged to date. And as I mentioned, we have about 41 lakes across 60 locations with 24 lake associations engaged. And we hope to see that to be 25 very soon. So I'd just like to take a moment to compare and contrast the different lake monitoring programs that address Haliburton County. On the far left, we have the Lake Partner program that is driven by volunteer samplers. It's done once per year in this region, and it's testing 4 parameters. So Secchi depth, total phosphorus, calcium, and chloride. Moving forward to the next 2 columns, much more comprehensive suites of parameters that are being sampled, but you'll note at a much longer timeline. The frequency is much less infrequent. For MECP, projected every 5 to 8 years, but we've seen some lakes that are even exceeding that 8-year margin as of 2024. The Ministry of Northern Development and Natural Resources and Forests have their broad-scale monitoring program, again, every 4 to 6 years for selected lakes in the region. This falls within lakes of Fish Management Zone 15. And again, this whole suite is being tested across the program, but at a very infrequent timeline. The 4th column here is actually sampled from your lake association. It was the sample parameters that were being tested ahead of the genesis of this water quality program. So these were ones that were identified as of interest for your particular lake association and did lead towards the development of our water quality program. It was very well recognized that these are the parameters that we should be testing. And then we ran several summits with some ecological environmental experts to gauge what other parameters and other things that we should be including when we roll out this water quality program. So with our program, one of the unique things here is that we're testing 3 times per year. So once in the spring after spring snowmelt, once in the fall, and once in the winter when ice allows. As we can know, last year we saw a very disappointing amount of ice coverage in Haliburton County. These are some of the challenges that we'll have to work with, possibly amending timelines as to when we're going out to be more in line with maximized ice coverage. But as we go forward, that will be the endeavor to have a holistic resampling events per year. I'll get more into the rationale later on for one of these, but in the refining of our parameter list, we have done some removal and some addition of some parameters. So for nitrite, NO2, we saw that across all of the samples that were processed in the program, not a single one was at a concentration above the limit of reporting, which is the minimum concentration required to be detected at our lab partner. So we have now removed that from the program and added in a duplicate total phosphorus sample to increase our quality control and quality assurance purposes. I'll show you in a few slides as to what the rationale for that was. So for the Kennisis Lakes, we have 5 sampling locations, 2 on Little Kennisis, 2 on Big Kennisis, 1 on Paddy's Bay. These were selected based on MECP historical sampling within our lake trout program. They do represent the mid-lake deep spot basins of the lake. So these are the deepest locations on the lakes that are non-mixing with each other. So they are mutually exclusive in terms of the water columns. And then there was an additional site added on Paddy's Bay, which is a small body of water with a high population density, high property density as well, which can be very susceptible to things like nutrient overloading and other things that, areas that have high human involvement and input from anthropogenic activities that could be altering the water chemistry and nutrient levels. So that site was added as well, comprising of 5 sites for Kennisis Lakes. So here I just have 2 result tables from the previous 2 years' reports. Both of those reports are available on our database. So on the left, we have results from July and September of 2022. And everything looks very, very good shape. We do have one outlier where the pH level on Little Kennisis 2, back up, which is the eastern site on Little Kennisis, was marginally above the upper guideline limit for pH, which runs from a low end 6.5 up to 8.5. So we saw a measured value of 8.6. Everything else was in very good shape. We did see on Paddy's Bay in that same sampling period, pH was approaching the upper guideline limit, but no exceedance. Moving forward to 2023's data, where we were sampling in March, June, September, we see a lot more red squares on these charts. Exclusively towards the September sampling period, we have higher elevated levels of total phosphorus and ammonia. And preliminary thoughts here is that we've seen some sample contamination. Looking at the trends of the data we have in the sampling period before and the sampling period after, it doesn't make sense that we would see levels that high. Also looking at the ammonia levels, the pH values don't seem to match up. If we had high concentrations of ammonia, in theory, we would see elevated levels of more alkaline pH in the water, and we just aren't seeing that here. So again, leads me to think that we are seeing some contamination in the samples, in which we've adjusted and robusted our, didn't mean to make that rhyme, our protocols and procedures for taking samples from the lake. So just to look at what the averages would be when we include and omit those samples or those particular outliers, recognizing that the guideline limit for total phosphorus in this case is 0.01 milligrams per liter, which was identified by relevant Ontario literature from other sampling programs. We can see that there are elevated levels, though the average guideline, or though the average concentration across all sites, all sampling periods for Kennisis Lakes is still below that 0.01 milligram guideline. When we remove that, it becomes much lower to 0.04, being much more in tune with what we're seeing at our reference site on Stocking Lake. When we remove those outliers, we also still see 2 spikes on Little Kennisis for total phosphorus in the fall of 2022. And these coincide with some observed sightings of some shoreline fertilizations, possibly causing those elevated levels, because we do see in subsequent events when those observations were not made, things are much more in tune with our reference site, which is what we're looking to see. So here I just have the 4 seasons sampled in 2022 and early 2023. The purple bar being the Kennisis Lakes data, it also has a star over it. So in the summer of 2022, very well in tune with other lakes of that geographic area, Halls and Pox Lakes, Halibut Forest, Stocking Lake, Redstone Lake as well, very in tune with what we would be hypothesizing to see in the summer, where there's higher amounts of biological activity, thus higher amounts of phosphorus uptake by organisms. Then when we move towards the fall, we do see a decrease in biological activity and a higher increase in decomposition of organic material, which is then leading towards elevated levels of total phosphorus. That's something seen across the board with the program and all of the sites that we've been sampling. Then moving on to the bottom left, we have our plots from winter 2023. We did sampling on on Spruce Lake, Stocking Lake, and Big and Little Kennisis Lakes. And again, very much in tune with what we're looking to see for these time periods. We have decreased levels of uptake, but also decreased levels of decomposition in the colder temperature months. And then on the bottom right, we start to see things return to what we're seeing on the top left as we approach the spring season. One thing to note is that in the spring of 2023, it was pulled back about 1 month or 4 weeks earlier than it was in the previous year during the pilot year. So in 2022, spring sampling, air quote, spring sampling was done around June, July, whereas in 2023, that was pulled back to be May and June centric. And just as well as with nutrients, we can also see some seasonal variation with dissolved oxygen as well. So these are listed in chronological order in terms of date, but they don't coincide with this figure on the left. So I'll start here with winter stratification. We see very low temperatures going from surface being the coldest all the way to at depth being heated up by the core of the earth being the warmest available. We also see separate bands without overlap for dissolved oxygen, very, very high at the surface, decreasing as it reaches depth, but again, substantially higher than what we're seeing in the subsequent seasons throughout the year. Then as we move into summer stratification, we do start to see some overlaps of these curves. And it's with temperature decreasing as it moves from surface to depth, and dissolved oxygen increasing as it's moving from surface to depth. Knowing that warm water is doing a poorer job of holding on to oxygen than colder water. And as we move into the fall, we start to see a separation of those two curves. So really accentuate the relationship between physical and chemical parameters and how they cycle and have variation throughout the year. Yeah. So thank you very much. I have contact information here below in case any questions, comments, or anything else arises after this meeting. But by all means, at the end of this meeting, any questions that you have, feel free to ask. And I just have this slide included in case there was any questions as to what we're sampling in our total metals, and we can get at that, the Q&A process towards the end. Thank you very much.
Hi guys, so I'm going to be taking over, I guess, for this point. Am I good to go?
You're good to go, Annie.
Perfect. So I did a study on microplastic pollution in 5 different lakes across Haliburton, and Kennisis Lake was one of them. So I'm just going to start. Frank, if you want to go to the next slide.
Sorry about that.
Perfect, that's okay. So as you know, they have been doing water sampling in a variety of lakes. So this project, I was focusing specifically on 5 lakes, and we were looking at samples that were collected from 2022 to 2023 for microplastics. So the purpose of this was to generate kind of a baseline microplastics abundance and characteristics database that we can use as reference for when we do more microplastic collection and studies in the future, because we haven't done any sort of microplastic water quality testing before. And in addition to this, I was also doing a literature review of current sampling and filtering methods for microplastics, and looking at what waters in different areas in Haliburton region and other regions are also looking like in terms of microplastic concentrations in their waters. So for this project, I had 5 main research questions that I was sort of aiming to answer. So I was looking firstly at the abundance and concentration of microplastics in the waters that we sampled, looking to see if concentration of microplastics had to do with seasonal variability. So looking at the microplastics across the different sampling periods. We also looked at what are the potential sources of microplastics based on the types and polymers that we found. Also looking at whether these microplastic abundances in your waters were related to anthropogenic activity on the lakes, or if concentration was due to outside and external sources. And then finally, we were just looking at what can be done to mitigate and to minimize microplastic pollution in Haliburton County lakes. Perfect. So for those of you who aren't aware, or maybe need a little catch up, I'm just going to go over quickly what microplastics are, since they're kind of a new and emerging pollutant of concern that we're looking at. So microplastics are characterized as plastic particles that are less than 5 millimeters in size. So we have 2 different types of microplastics. It kind of gets broken down into 2 categories. Primary is when microplastics were originally manufactured this size, whether that's little plastic beads and pellets that are used in different personal care products, such as like scrubs that have little beads in it. things like that. And then secondary microplastics are microplastics that are formed through the breakdown of larger plastic pieces. So whether that's plastic bottles, plastic bags that just have slowly degraded and broken down into sizes less than 5 millimeters. And then finally, we kind of categorize microplastics into 5 different categories based on the type of plastic shape that they are. So we categorize them as either films, fibers, fragments, beads, and foams. And just on the right there, I have some pictures of some of the microplastics that I found in some of the samples that we took from these Halliburton County lakes. And so I just want to highlight the 2 that look like little pieces of string. Those ones are fibers, and those have been found to be the most commonly found microfiber or microplastic type, in the environment. Yeah, so these are the 5 lakes that we included in our study, just kind of a subset of the number of lakes that have been sampled for water quality parameters and testing. So as you can see, they're all a variety of different sizes and also of different proximities to urban areas. And so that's why these lakes were kind of chosen, just to give us a wide range of baselines for lakes of different sizes and of different proximity to different anthropogenic sources. So I'm just going to quickly go over some sampling just to give you guys an idea of how we did this. So as Frank has already explained, water was collected via U-Links and the cottage associations under the lake water quality monitoring programs that have been occurring. So what we collected exactly in each of these lakes were 4-liter bulk samples of the surface water. So we had big jugs that were collected at each of the sites during each of the different sample periods. In addition to this, all the other water quality parameters were also measured, including water and air temperatures, the depth of the lake, pH, conductivity. And this sampling occurred in all 4 seasons, so spring, summer, winter, and fall. So the only season that was a bit of a challenge, I think, for most of this water collection was during winter when they had to do under ice sampling. Yeah. So once all the samples were collected from the field, I brought them into the lab, and kind of what we did was, just to kind of break it down easily, we had a few different steps. So once we collected the water, we brought it to the lab, and we had little filter papers. And so all of the bulk water samples were filtered through filter papers in order to collect all the debris and all the microplastics that were in the water. Next, after this, I used a microscope in the lab upstairs to do counts of all the different microplastics that I could find on each of the filter papers from each of the samples in each of the lakes. So this was a little bit time consuming, but how we did it was we did a visual test. So we looked to see if there were any particles that were standing out at us as inorganic versus organic, so whether they were brightly colored. We also used a blue light, and we also used a hot needle test to confirm that the pieces that we were finding actually were plastics and that we weren't misidentifying any pieces of debris on the filter papers. And then finally, once I had counted all of the microplastics on each of the papers, we moved on and did FTIR analysis, which is a big machine that basically determines the polymer types for each of the microplastic pieces that we found. So determining the polymer type for these microplastics is important because this can help us determine where the original source of these plastics were, based on how we can what type of plastic it ended up being. So I'm going to move on to some results. I'm going to start with some general results and conclusions from all 5 of the lakes, and then I'm going to narrow in onto Kennisis Lake for you guys. So for the concentration of microplastics across all the lakes, we did see some pretty big variation, with Spruce Lake having the highest concentrations. So Spruce Lake, I don't know if you remember from the map or if you guys just know from the area, it's a comparatively small lake compared to Kennisis Lake, and it is much closer proximity to Halliburton. And so we're thinking that the reason that why this site had higher concentrations was just due to direct anthropogenic inputs of pollution into the lakes. So our average concentration across all lakes was 2.7 microplastics per liter. So this ranged from the lowest at 2 microplastics per liter at Winona Lake to 3.5 at Spruce Lake. So those were the lowest and the highest concentrations that we found. And so our question at the beginning, one of them was, does lake size have an influence? From this, we can see that it doesn't have a strong influence. And we've also, this was confirmed with some other studies that have been done in the area, that lake size is only weakly correlated to microplastic concentrations in these lakes in the area. So this kind of led us to predict that the main source of input of microplastic pollution into these lakes was from atmospheric deposition. So moving on to see if there was any seasonal variability, which we can clearly see there is some seasonal variability across the lakes. So this definitely leads us to conclude that concentrations are based on hydrological flows and water levels at different times throughout the year. So we see that during summer, we see high concentrations of microplastics, which can be associated likely with low water volumes and low water levels during the summertime. And that spring also has high concentrations in the summertime, and spring has lowest concentrations. This is likely due to spring melt and an increase in water level, kind of creating a dilution effect for the concentrations of microplastics per liter of water collected. The one that I wanted to point out is the winter sampling. So I just wanted to point out that this sample season isn't fully representative of what truly could be in these waters because, as I explained earlier, sampling in the winter is a tricky process. And so I don't think that we quite have enough samples across the lakes for this season to be conclusive about this. So this is also, these results are consistent with results from other studies as well that have been done on Muskoka headwater lakes, which averaged approximately the same concentration of microplastics in the same seasons and had spring and beginning of summer as the highest concentration time period. So in terms of the compositions, as I explained at the beginning, we sort microplastics into 5 different categories. And based on other research that we had found and done in the literature review, we guessed that we would find fiber as the highest percentage of microplastic pieces. And this was consistent with what we found in our results. So this may be due to a few different reasons. So we see that fibers were highest at 67% of the sample particles being fibers. So this may be because they're easy to identify if they're long and larger than other particle sizes, but also because we concluded that the main source of this pollution into the lake was from atmospheric deposition, and fibers do travel through the air farther distances than the other shapes. And so this is also consistent with the study that was done on Muskoka headwater lakes. They also found that fibers were the highest percentage of found microplastic pieces. Their ranges were from 51% to 67% as well. So now I'm just gonna get on to Kennisis Lake, which is what you guys are likely interested in. So we did 5 different sites in this lake. So we had some at Big Kennisis, Little Kennisis, and also Patty's Bay. So Kennisis was a better lake for our study because we had multiple sites within this one water body. So this gives us the chance to explore the variation within the lakes at different sites. So we can see that Big Kennisis 2 and Big Kennisis Site 4 had consistently higher values compared to the other area. And this partially might be due to it being a larger area of water. So we likely see more activity on this portion of the lake. And to go along with this, Little Kennisis 1 and 2 had lower values. So we're assuming that this is associated with the smaller lake area and maybe lessened anthropogenic activity on the lake. Yeah, so just some of our key findings show that the variation that we found across the lakes likely reflects the human activity on the lake, as well as the lake characteristics, including size and different flow levels. So we saw that out of the 5 lakes that I looked at, Spruce Lake had the highest, and Kennisis was much lower than Spruce Lake, and that anthropogenic activity, lake size, and proximity to urban areas had the largest influence, or I guess proximity to urban areas had the highest influence on the concentration of microplastics in your waters. As well, we saw, yes, there was seasonal differences, with spring being the lowest concentrations and summers being the highest concentrations, and that microplastics in your lakes were dominated by fibers, which likely reflects textile inputs and potentially atmospheric sources of input into your lake versus direct input of particles, but due to cottage owners and users on the lake. Yeah, so just in the future, some recommendations that I made in the report were to continue on with this research now that we kind of have baseline levels for your lake and for 4 other lakes in the area, so that we can see whether the microplastic concentrations are increasing at an alarming rate or not. And as well, just to keep consistency with these samples, and especially with the winter season, so that we can really determine what the seasonal variability is looking like across all seasons, so that we aren't limited in the amount of data that we are able to collect. So just in general, the more data that we can get for each lake will help us to have more conclusive results for, yeah, all the microplastic research that we've been doing.
Thanks, Annie.
Awesome, and that's where I'm going to end it there.
Okay, fantastic. And we will have time for questions at the end for both Frank and Anne.
Just to briefly add to that, we also have a master's student that's going to be segueing off of all the great work Annie's been doing, elevating that over the next 2 years. So take on the other lakes that have been sampled and yeah, continue Annie's great work.
Okay, next slide, Frank. Okay, so what can we do? And we should all be doing our part to look after water quality in terms of the benthic measurements, in terms of the physical and chemical parameters, and as well as reducing microplastic pollution. It's good to see the initial information is that microplastics are airborne rather than coming from all of us, but I am suspicious we're probably putting a little bit of microplastics in the lake as well. And I'll talk a little bit about maybe what we can do. So what can we do to sustain our good water quality? As I mentioned at the beginning, managing our septic systems properly is probably the #1 thing. The main contributor for nutrients, total phosphorus, ammonia in our lake are our septic systems. We have a septic inspection program in Dysart. They're a little late on the second round, but do your best to do septic inspections, maintain your septics. Don't put things in the septic system that are going to stop that natural microbial action. Have a look at our website. We just published a brand new septic tips guideline that you can download, hang in the kitchen, and that's some good advice. Keep your shorelines natural. The deep-rooted shoreline plants take those nutrients out that come out of our septic systems. Every liter that goes in the septic, a liter comes out, and that it's typically full of some nutrients. So those natural shorelines with the deep-rooted plants help to pull that up. And eliminating the use of fertilizers and pesticides. We just shouldn't be using fertilizers and pesticides on our lakes. In terms of microplastic pollution, what can we do? We can reduce the use of plastics at the lake. So do your best to keep grocery bags, straws, disposable cutlery, coffee lids. And if they do get out and around, they can get in the lake and they can get ground up and in the lake. Recycle plastic waste where you can. clean up litter near the lakes. There's a number of us that go to the dam and other areas, and we do see plastic littered around. Avoid products containing microbeads. So these would be cosmetics, suntan lotion, and it's really difficult to find out, but you can usually go online and find out which products that you would be using near the lake contain microbeads. Some microplastics also come from the plastic pouches for laundry soap and for dishwasher soap. So be careful what you're using there. And last but not least, actually, there's one more after this. Properly dispose of your old nylon and polypro rope. When it starts to degrade, it just takes a beating in the sunshine, and replace it with higher quality rope. There's no good answer for this. We all use rope on our docks, but if you can, once you see a sign of degradation, get rid of that old rope and dispose of it properly. There's one other change that's been made in the province of Ontario as well. If you're refurbishing your dock or buying a new dock, ensure that the dock floats are roto-molded polyethylene, the black floats with foam on the inside. Styrofoam billets are no longer allowed in docks in Ontario. So that's something to keep in mind because they do degrade. Okay, next slide. So a couple of thanks. The water quality monitoring programs are funded by the KLCOA, so to your membership dollars that are going to these. Thanks to the KLCOA for supporting this. The testing by the KLCOA water quality team, who are our citizen scientists, Julie Bram, Margaret Cox, Jim Gay, Wendy Murray, Tracy Stewart, Randy Birch, Duncan Kent, and Donna Doucette. And 3 of our folks actually do the Lake Partner Program independent from that, which is Julie Bram, Tim Tibbs, and Kathy Hephill. Julie does Little K, Tim Tibbs and Kathy do the Big Lake. And also Haliburton County contributed $100,000 for 2024 and 2025 to these programs across Haliburton County. So we have to thank the councilors from all the municipalities who voted in favor of supporting those programs. Next slide. And a special thanks to Frank and Annie for coming to put on this webinar tonight. Great information, and I'm sure you've got some questions. So we'll open up the floor. You can unmute yourself, put your hand up, or unmute yourself and start off with some questions if you want. I didn't see anything in chat that was a question. Did you, Deb?
There's nothing in chat, and I don't see any hands up yet.
I have a quick question for Annie. What was the benefit of using blue light for detecting the microplastics after doing the filtration process?
Yeah, sure. So during the actual identifying of the microplastic pieces on the filter paper, it can be pretty tricky because they can be really small and you get lots of organic debris on the papers as well. And so for microplastics that aren't brightly colored, say bright green or bright blue. If they're clear, they can be a lot harder to identify just with your eye. So when you use the blue light, it kind of illuminates the inorganic pieces. And so it allows you to easily identify pieces that you could have missed if you weren't using it.
Awesome.
Thanks, Annie. Jeff P., you have your hand up. If you can unmute yourself and fire away.
Yeah, I'm just curious. We've been monitoring for blue-green algae, and does that tie in any way with the results that we're seeing for chemistry? Is there a correlation between the kind of an increasing prevalence, I think, than what it used to be?
I can start off with that. Maybe Frank, you could jump in. Mostly, we believe due to climate change, there have been increases in blue-green algal events. We've had 2 reported events on the Kennisis Lakes, one in Little K, which was not verified by an MECP sample, but the photographs and other limnologists that looked at it certainly agreed that it was a blue-green algal event. We did have a second algal event in the fall of September 2023. I think,
yeah,
yes,
it was during the Labor Day weekend, actually.
Right after the Labor Day weekend. And that was a verified blue-green algal bloom, but it was non-toxic. So there's a couple of good news stories out of this. We believe we've had a couple and they haven't been toxic, at least the second one that was tested. there has been in the past presumption that there's a connection between nutrient loading, which is usually measured by total phosphorus, and blue-green algal events, and that has been consistent. And the best recommendation still is to reduce the amount of nutrient loading in our lakes to keep them healthy. However, Muskoka has moved ahead and done what they call causation studies. And those have shown that it's not consistent, because some lakes that do have low total phosphorus, as measured by the program we're measuring, could still experience blue-green algal blooms. And what happens is when certain climate events occur, or weather events occur, the hideout nutrients in the bottom of the lake get stirred up a little bit, and the algae can feed on those and cause a bloom. So this is all relatively new research and investigations about blue-green algal events, and we are watching this closely. A couple of things that are really practical. On our website, we have instructions for reporting blue-green algae events and for responses. And if you do see one, it's really important to report it, because they can be toxic. They can be very harmful to pets. They can kill pets, and they can make people really sick. So I hope I've answered some of that question, Jeff. Yes, it's important to measure the water quality, because we don't know where we would be. But the direct connection between the parameters we're measuring and predicting blue-green algae is more complex than that. How about you, Frank? Anything
Thank
to
you.
add?
Thank you very much. That was awesome. And I should have started by saying what a great presentation. You know, the idea of putting this on and the information is awesome. This is a great effort.
Yeah, thank you. To segue off of what Jim was saying, other methods of introduction. So look at, what Jim was referring to is commonly called legacy phosphorus, phosphorus bound in the substrate that gets released by disturbance, high wake in shallower areas. The other thing that could be happening, not so much, I guess, with Kennisis Lake, but in low dissolved oxygen environment called internal loading, where in anoxic or very low dissolved oxygen environment, the microbial activity moves away from digesting organic compounds, and they start breaking down sediment, which has phosphorus bound to it, which then makes it released for biological uptake. Both of those can be addressed through the sampling that we're doing to keep an eye on when levels are rising, and maybe correlate those to some specific events. So I know with the Labor Day weekend last year, very, very warm weather and high amounts of boat traffic. Likely what was happening was a stirring up of the substrate, which was then making more phosphorus available. And it just so happens that that coincides with when our sampling periods are, and we're able to detect those levels.
Thanks.
7:45.
Okay, and Scott had his
Yeah,
hand up.
Scott has his hand up.
Thanks, Jim. Just a question. Again, great presentation. Appreciate the conversation tonight. Was there any consideration last year for the significant event we had when the Bone Lake Beaver Dam broke? I don't know if the inflow into Big K was sufficient to change our water quality or change the readings, but certainly Bone Lake is always, a contributor to water in Kennisis, although, it's kind of a spring-based thing, and by summer it's not happening. But when the Beaver Dam broke, there's no doubt that the inflow had some localized change to water quality. Was that in the conversation at all, or looked at in any of the readings that were taken late in the summer? And maybe a comment about that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. So we did actually acknowledge that when we were developing our water quality report that housed the 2023 data. What's to be expected, large amounts of substances that are resulting from the breakdown and decomposition of detritus and other organic materials, in theory, could be introduced through that pathway. Again, where we are at with the sampling program so far, we're taking, how do I phrase this? We have data that omit events like that. And then when we have events like that, we can see spikes to measure to some degree the level of introduction that's happening, but of course we don't have testing locations that are happening right at those sites. We can just see what's happening as the water is mixing and look at elevated levels from there. If you have the opportunity to read the 2023 issued report, it does acknowledge that Bone Lake beaver failure and or dam failure, and we look at that in relation to the ammonia levels that we saw.
Thanks, Frank.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up, but we do have a note from Cam Douglas. So well done, Jim, Frank, and Annie. If we were to do this again, I would love to see some time series phosphorus and dissolved oxygen graphs. The concentrations at any one point is perhaps less important than the trends over time.
Yep, absolutely agree. And that's one of the endeavors of this program, is to get long-term monitoring data that we can look at as baselines for future endeavors, looking at the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of legislative change, any other decision-making that may be amended by the data we're providing. As this program continues to evolve, we will be looking to do some more extensive time series analyses. To date, we have 6 now sampling events under the belt for Kennisis Lakes. And as those continue to grow, visualization and other representations with the data, as you mentioned, become more possible.
Are there any other questions from people? We've got a hand up. Kathy, do you want to unmute?
It's David Windross, actually.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I'm on my wife's computer, so.
That's okay. Hi, David.
Just wondered, in terms of water flow into the lake and the roads, our property is at the bottom of a fairly significant hill, and at the end of any large rainstorm or in the spring runoff, there's an incredible amount of water that comes down the road and right across the property right into the lake. So is there anything like Dysart can provide input into this as well? I don't know what they use on the roads in the wintertime, if they use anything. I don't know if they do anything in the summer, in terms of, because the amount of water that goes into the lake just from nature and the flow of water into the lake it's pretty significant, I think, especially when there's a road that goes completely around the lake pretty much, and it's fairly close to the lake. So, well, there's just a general question. Really don't just asking that question.
I could start on that one. Is it Dave? Dave Windross?
I think, yes.
David, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. So a couple of points there. Dysart doesn't use salt on our roads specifically, and calcium would be the measurement. And I'll talk just in a second about calcium measurements. But we do believe that they put a little bit of salt in their sand so that it isn't frozen solid when they put it in the trucks to distribute it. So there's still going to be some calcium effect. At the initial part of the bigger program, we were not sampling for calcium. We were relying on the Lake Partner program once a year done in the spring to measure calcium, which is probably the right time to look. I'm sorry, chlorine, not calcium. No, step back. So for chlorine. And we were relying on that Lake Partner indicator for chlorine. And as Frank said, we've been meeting with in a water quality summit with limnologists to give us advice on what we ought to do. And they've said, well, if you're measuring multiple times over the year, you really ought to add chlorine back in there. And so that's what we've done.
Well,
Anything additional, Frank?
No, I think you've addressed anything I would have brought up. Well, segueing back on the Beaver Dam inquiry, I think that any events like that are always warrantable to reach out and report those types of observations. They do get noted in the reports. So if there's anything that any of you note or see or know of, feel free. My contact information is included in these slides, and reach out, let us know, because we're not always in that area. You folks are the local expert knowledge holders. for the Kennisis Lakes, and anything that we can do to increase the insight of what we're doing with our reporting and monitoring, very well appreciated and welcome.
Okay, I think that's probably it, Deb.
I think so. There are no more questions that I can see. So
I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Our water is critically important to us. It's where we play, where we drink. So keep up the great work, everybody. The message, bottom line, is we've got great water quality. We want to keep it that way. So, and have a great summer. See you on
thanks,
the water.
Jim. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Annie. Have a good evening, everyone.